Okay, so I think we're all set up now. Good morning, welcome, and thank you so much for joining the session this morning. My name is Pamela Thomas. I am the Digital Accessibility Specialist with TTS. And if you found this session through a direct email on the social media listserv, that's great. But just so that you know, I do have quite a few sessions available in the Tufts Learning Center. If you're interested in learning more about digital accessibility, you'll find my sessions by searching the keywords digital accessibility in the Tufts Learning Center, or we do also have that biweekly staff newsletter that goes out alerting you to upcoming classes, and you'll find my sessions listed there as well. So as I mentioned, I will be recording today's session and I'll send the link out afterwards. So what I'm going to do though is I will stop the recording before the Q&A period, so that if you're not comfortable speaking, knowing it's being recorded, that's fine. You can save your questions to the end if you'd like, and I'll be sure to stop the recording before we have our Q&A section. So once again, thank you so much for joining the session this morning, and I think we should go ahead and get started. So today's topic is accessible social media. And the first thing I like to talk about in all of my sessions is what we mean by accessibility, specifically digital accessibility. When we're talking about digital accessibility, I like to go with the definition that is used in the Tufts Digital Accessibility Policy, and also this is the definition that's used at the US Department of Education. So it's the principle of designing electronic content in such a way that users with disabilities can three things: acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as someone without a disability. And this should be in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use. In a nutshell, gone are the days where we would have another accessible format of our digital content. All of our digital content should be created with accessibility in mind. And this applies to our social media communication as well. I also like to start by just reminding folks of the different types of disabilities and disability prevalence in the United States. So when we're talking about disabilities, we're talking about a whole range of types of disabilities, from cognitive or learning disabilities. This could be things like something that affects reading, like dyslexia, for example, maybe a disability that affects attention, that affects memory or learning. So all of these would fall under the category of cognitive disabilities. Visual disabilities, so someone who is blind or has limited or low vision, or maybe some one of the many forms of color blindness, these would fall under the category of visual disabilities. Auditory, of course, would be people who are deaf or hard of hearing. So auditory disabilities would affect the hearing, the sense of hearing. Motor, you may not think of motor disabilities at first when you're thinking of digital content, but think, for example, of someone who has a disability that affects their fine motor control. So someone who may not use a traditional mouse, for example, and relies on their keyboard or maybe voice control to interact with our digital content. So people with disabilities that affect motor control can also use adaptive devices to interact with digital content. And finally, speech. Now, you may not, again, you may not think of digital right away when you're thinking of someone who has a disability that affects their speech, but there are cases where, for example, voice recognition is getting much better, but someone who has a disability that affects their speech may have difficulty using applications that require some kind of voice activation or voice interaction. So just to sort of remind everybody of the types of disabilities that I'm talking about today. And also remember that these are not necessarily always permanent. So disabilities can be temporary. At one point in our lives, one point or another in all of our lives, we will experience some kind of disability, whether it's permanent or temporary. And they can also be situational. So in other words, when I'm in a specific environment, I find it difficult to see certain things, or when I'm in a specific environment, I find it difficult to hear certain things. So they can also be situational. So just as a reminder, that when we're talking about disability, we're talking about accessibility, it's a whole range of different disabilities. According to the latest figures from the CDC, more than 1 in 4 adults, and now this is for adults 18 and older in the United States, report having some kind of disability that could fall into one of those categories we just talked about. And this is a large number when you think about it. More than 28% of the population does report having some kind of a disability. When we're looking at our constituency, and especially social media, remember that it's not just about, you know, a homogenous group of students. We have an incredibly diverse audience for social media. We do, of course, have students and prospective students. They're looking to engage in our educational content and in our campus events. They want to learn about campus events and engage in community discussion. And if our communication is not accessible, this can affect the inclusion and sense of belonging for students with disabilities or prospective students with disabilities. Don't forget parents and families as well, who often rely on our social media communication to stay informed about their students' educational experience. Alumni and donors, you may not immediately think of, but donors and potential donors, we want to maximize engagement. And when we look at that statistic of 28% of adults, if you look a little bit, you dive a little more deeply into that data, you'll find that, of course, not surprisingly, as we get older, the prevalence of disability increases. So the chances that our alumni donors and potential donors do have some kind of a disability is in fact greater. So, and finally, institutional reputation. This is a socially conscious world, and we are increasingly judged on our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we need to keep that in mind as well. Social media in particular can be quite challenging to people with disabilities, and this is for a number of reasons. First, the very complex and constantly changing user interfaces. I can just bring up X, for example, and I just noticed that my graphic still has the Twitter logo on it. I'll have to update that. But when Elon Musk took over Twitter, he just completely wiped out the accessibility team for some unknown reason. And all of a sudden, features that users were used to suddenly were gone. And they're just constantly changing user interfaces, which can be quite challenging for all users, actually, but for people with disabilities in particular. And when accessibility features are available in these platforms, sometimes they're hidden, or they're just very minimal attention paid to accessibility features. Equally challenging is the fact that it's user generated content. So there's really no editor, there's no editing board, right? Like there's nobody monitoring all of the content that goes up in social media platforms. And it's largely visual. So we have GIFs and memes and visual text. So we'll be talking about ways to make sure that in this complex, constantly changing environment with uneven support for accessibility, how can we make sure that our communication is as accessible as possible given the complexity? Everything I'm going to be talking about is in line with existing policies. University Communications and Marketing, as you probably know, has a social media best practices site. I've linked to it. You'll have the PowerPoint. If you joined late, I did share a link to the PowerPoint. I will be sending it out with the follow-up email as well, so you'll have a link. But there is a social media best practices site and a policy for official social media accounts. Both of these, or this whole social media best practices set of pages, do talk about accessibility best practices, and everything that I'm going to be sharing is directly in line with these policies and best practices. So let's talk about these tips and best practices for making our social media communication as accessible as possible given the complex nature of these platforms. I'm going to be focusing on several areas, specifically the language that we use, the use of hashtags and mentions. I'm going to be talking about best practices for links and images, animations and GIFs, and for videos. So it's a lot to cover, but let's start talking. Let's start with inclusive language. So when we're talking about disability, one of the first things that I want to say is that you really should refer to someone's disability only when it's relevant. If a faculty member is sharing a presentation, that faculty member happens to be blind or have limited vision or use a wheelchair, if that's not relevant to the article that you're sharing, that really isn't something that you want to call out. So is this relevant to call out a disability in your social media post is the first thing that you should consider. When talking about disability, in general, something that we call person first language instead of identity first language. And I have some examples on the next slide, but in general, person first language is, let's say that faculty member who happens to be blind, you would use person first. It is a faculty member who is blind, not identity first, a blind faculty member. Obviously, if you are referring to or linking to or referencing a specific person, the best thing to do is going to be to ask that person or investigate for yourself, visit their website, look at their page. How do they refer to themselves and follow their lead? Because in general, person first language is what we want to stick with, but people have different preferences when it comes to how you refer to their disability. When you're using language, we want to make sure that in general our language is inclusive, and there are some things that we say without realizing that they may be considered offensive to some people. These are considered what we call ableisms that would be offensive to someone with a disability. And these are things that you may not think of at first, calling something lame. And again, I have some examples on the next slide. But sayings like someone is blind to the fact that, or something falls on deaf ears. These are sort of, this is language that relies on old, outdated ideas that someone who is deaf is ignorant, or someone who is blind is ignorant. And we need to avoid using these kinds of, this kind of language. You also want to avoid euphemisms, things like differently abled or handy-capable. Now, again, if you are writing a post about someone who's using these words, maybe a program that uses these words, then you want to follow their lead. But in general, we don't need to use euphemisms. Disability is not a bad word. Okay, it's much better to say disability rather than differently abled or handy-capable. Again, follow their lead. I see now special needs is also considered one of those euphemisms that some people object to. However, special needs is also in a lot of program names. So if you're referring to a special needs program in a school, for example, that's not going to offend anyone. But referring to someone as a special needs student not affiliated with a program with that name may be considered offensive. So we have to, it's very delicate. We just want to avoid euphemisms, follow the lead of whoever it is that you're writing about or whatever it is that you're linking to. I do have some links here. There's a disability language style guide, which is from the NCDJ, and I wish I could remember exactly what that stood for. It's a journalist's site for writing about disability, and also the guidelines for writing about people with disabilities, which is also from a disability site. Now, just to reinforce that, just some specific examples. So that person first language, disabled student, instead of that, say a student with a disability. That's person first language. Never say normal or able-bodied. You want to say a person without a disability. If it's relevant that that person does not have a disability, then it's person without a disability. Again, instead of mentally disabled, how about has a cognitive disability? Things like confined to a wheelchair are kind of cringy. We don't want to say things like confined to a wheelchair. uses a wheelchair. It's that sense of empowerment. I'm not confined to my wheelchair. I use a wheelchair. I have a disability that affects my mobility. I use a wheelchair. And then that category of insane, crazy, lame, those harken back to the days again when insane, crazy, lame were offensive terms. Now they've sort of entered the vernacular. We need to think about using words that better describe what it is we're trying to communicate and don't have that history. So amazing, awesome, wild, awful, unpleasant, boring. There's so much language we could use instead of these. So inclusive language. So as long as we're talking about language, we do want to be inclusive, but we also want to be clear. Avoiding confusion. Now remember, not all disabilities affect vision and hearing. There is a large population of people that have cognitive or reading disabilities. Avoid confusion, avoid overuse of acronyms and abbreviations. I know that there are character limits in our posts, but if possible, avoid overuse of acronyms and abbreviations. Limit excessive emojis, or especially emojis between words. So the best example I can think of is using the clapping hands between words in a fun way to say, overuse of acronyms and abbreviations, we're by putting the clapping hands in between each word. That's actually read aloud by a screen reader, and it also interrupts reading for someone who has a disability that affects their ability to read. So maybe dyslexia, for example. So a screen reader is going to read overuse clapping hands, of clapping hands, acronyms clapping hands, and clapping hands. So it's going to read that emoji. Every occurrence of every emoji is read aloud by screen reading software. So we want to limit those emojis between words. There's nothing wrong with using emojis, but just don't do that in between words. It just interrupts the flow of reading and it's not clear. I want to comment on emojis versus emoticons. So when you use an emoji, it has built-in textual meaning. And if you're not familiar with it, there's something called the Emojipedia. And the Emojipedia is a great place. If you're not quite sure what a particular emoji means, the Emojipedia is a great place to find out. Just a quick aside, I used to work for Syracuse University, and they are the Syracuse University Orangemen, or Orange. And there's an orange in every social media post. I had to point out to them that it's not an orange, it's a tangerine. So every time someone reads a social media post with an orange in it, they're reading the Syracuse Tangerines, which was kind of funny. But so check the Emojipedia if you're not sure what an emoji means. But the nice thing is that they have those text alternatives. So if someone is using screen reading software, so they're having your social media posts read to them, that emoji will be read as its textual equivalent, which is great. Emoticons are just punctuation marks that we are using visually. So, the smiley face by using a colon, a dash, and a close paren, close paren. That's going to be read as colon dash close paren. So just be aware that emojis are better than emoticons, especially when it comes to screen reading software, but also overall readability. Finally, ASCII art. ASCII art, I have an example on the screen of something that Firefox shared. Now, this was shared a while ago. You can see it's I think it's an old Twitter post. Firefox created this muscle bound fox to say Firefox Relay is protecting your inbox from spam. And they did this using ASCII art. Well, a screen reader is going to read open parens backslash underscore underscore, forward slash close parens. It reads every single piece of punctuation. So this is not a good user experience for anyone who's using screen reading software. So just keep that in mind. While we're talking about readable text, we need to talk about text over images. Now, I know we do this in social media because of character limits, because we want to grab attention, and that's fine. I'm not saying don't do it, but just pay attention to readability. If you can avoid putting image on top of text, please do. Maybe put it alongside the text, maybe have your graphic sort of shade out to the bottom, what do they call it, gradient or something, so that your text is not directly over your image. And you can see on the slide just what a difference it makes to have some kind of shading behind the text. You also want to be mindful of color contrast. So I had to, in order to make that readable in the second graphic, I had to change the text from blue to white because the blue was not very readable on the dark shading background. So make sure you're putting some shading, preferably not putting images on top of text if you can avoid it. But if you have to, make sure you have significant shading behind the text to maximize readability, and just be mindful of your color contrast, which I'm going to talk a little bit about next. When we're talking about color contrast, well, you're communications folks, so you may already know this, but when we're talking about color contrast is the difference in relative luminance between two colors. Any two colors can be expressed in the form of a mathematical ratio. Black to white would be 21:1. That's as high contrast as you can get. Now, we don't need to live in a black and white world when it comes to our text, but that's as high contrast as you can get. In my example on the slide, you can see that as I go down to maybe a blue or a navy blue and then a royal blue and then a light blue, you can see that that ratio drops from 11:1, 7:1, 5:1. The lower the color contrast ratio, the more difficult it is to read. And unfortunately, blue is a difficult color. Light blue, if you're guessing at Tufts blue, it's very easy to choose a color that's too light to be easily readable. Now, there are recommended minimums. The recommended minimum is no less than 4.5:1 for normal size text or body text, the body of your post. No less than 3:1 for heading size text or larger text. So those are minimums I would recommend, especially for social media where people are usually on a mobile device. They could have their screen dimmed. They could be out in the sunlight. I would recommend exceeding those minimums, maybe shoot for 5:1 or maybe even a little higher. You don't have to guess. I have it open here and I have a link on the slide. You don't have to guess, and it's probably not a good idea to guess, especially with that light blue that I mentioned. But if I come to the Tufts brand guidelines site, and again, your communications folks, you probably know that this exists already, but I want to point something out. Under guidelines, if I come to the section on color, okay, you'll notice that there's the various shades of Tufts blue that are considered on brand. The ones that have the little eyeball symbol in the lower right corner are the ones that have been vetted for accessibility. So these would meet that minimum 4.5:1 for body text on a white background, which I believe for most social media, the default would be a white background. But if you're creating images and putting text on those images, just be mindful that these were tested on white. You may need to test yourself, and I'll show you how to do that. Or I'll show you where to do that. So it's not just blue and brown. There's an extended palette of colors that are considered on brand, and they do all have an indicator if they have been vetted for accessibility. So you don't have to guess. You can make sure that you are both accessible and on brand by using one of those colors. If you're using your own colors, you will have to check those colors yourself. There are a number of color contrast checkers available on the web. I've linked to one here called the WebAIM Color Contrast Checker, if it will open for me. There it is. Now they all work in a very similar way. You're basically going to grab that hex code. If you are doing work with color, you'll know that every color is given an identifying number. It can either be a 6-digit hex value. It could also be at what we call an RGB or red, green, blue value. But you'll need to know what that color code is for your color. So you would put your text color in the foreground box, you would put your background color in the background box, and it will tell you what the contrast ratio is. And remember, we're shooting for no less than, say, 5:1 would be a good target. It'll also give you nice examples of what that text is going to look like. So if I wanted, for example, to have it on gray, you can see how that has dropped down to a little over 2:1 and how difficult that would be for someone to read. So if you're trying to stay on brand, visit that Tufts brand guidelines page. And if you have your own colors, just pop out to a color contrast checker and make sure you're not dipping below that minimum contrast ratio. So let's move on to hashtags. So with hashtags, a couple tips. We want to make sure that we're using what we call camel case instead of all lowercase. Now, unfortunately, most social media platforms that prompt you for hashtags, the hashtags are in all lowercase, so you may have to edit them. But you'll want to make sure that you have Tufts Now with the T and the N capitalized, for example. And as an example, a screen reader will read Tufts Now if you've capitalized those. It'll read Tough Snow if you haven't. Go Jumbos becomes Ga Jumbos. Jumbo Pride becomes Jumbo Pride. So it's screen readers are impacted by not using camel case, but it's also readability, especially if you have multiple words combined in a hashtag. Another tip with hashtags is you're going to want to make sure you put them at the end of your posts instead of sprinkling them throughout the text. And this is just to maximize readability. So reasonable number of hashtags, use your camel case, and try not to interrupt text with a lot of hashtags. Put them at the end of the text. Same with the mentions, avoid overuse of mentions. Obviously, we're going to mention, but avoid overuse and avoid sprinkling them all over the text. Try putting them at the end of the message instead of interrupting your message with too many uses of those at mentions. Hyperlinks can be tricky. Not all social media platforms allow you to edit a hyperlink. You paste in a URL and that's what appears in the post. But where it's possible, there are a few verified accounts that do have the ability to edit hyperlinks. So where it's possible, you're going to want to edit that hyperlink so that it's readable text rather than a big URL string. This maximizes readability, and it also enhances usability because it's easier to figure out where that link goes if it's plain language rather than an HTTP : / whatever. For those that aren't able to edit the hyperlink format, you can use a link shortener. That's fine. So there are two things with hyperlinks. I think I have another slide on this. I do. But you also want to include the format. So if you're linking to something other than a web page, if it's a document, a PDF, a video, try to indicate that as part of the link in some way or in some way in the text. This is a usability issue as well as an accessibility issue. It's like giving the user a heads up, like, hey, this is going to open something else on your computer, or this is going to download something. So make sure you include the format if it's something other than a plain web page. So one other note about links. So I sort of go back and forth on this myself too, but in general, if you don't have the ability to edit your hyperlink and make it plain language, it's okay to use it, obviously, but try to keep it as short as possible and as plain language as possible. Get them to the highest level page you can where it still makes sense. And also, if it is very long, you can, as I said before, use that link shortener. But again, take care to make sure that you're making it clear where that link goes, especially, a bit.ly link or a tiny URL that removes any kind of clue from the URL as to where it's going. So it's a good idea to make it very clear in the message where that link will take the user. So let's talk about images. So social media is full of images. It's great. That's why we love it. When a screen reader user, in other words, someone who is using software that has digital content read aloud to them. So when a screen reader user encounters an image, the screen reader is going to look for what's known as alternative text. Now, this is a textual description of the image. Usually this is provided by you as the content owner, as the person who made the post, the person who uploaded the image is the person who's going to create that alternative text. when you're writing alternative text for a graphic, there are some rules of thumb here. It should be accurate and equivalent. So it should accurately describe what's in the graphic, and it should be equivalent. And by equivalent, I'm referring to text, which I talk about again in the last bullet. If you're sharing information via an image, then the alternative text should share that information as well. It should be as short as possible, succinct, and non-redundant. If the post already describes the image accurately, you can keep the alternative text extremely short. Just a very quick, President Kumar at a podium, or something very, very, very brief. You don't have to say image of or graphic of. It's already part of what the screen reader says. It says, here's an image and here's the description. So you don't waste your characters with image of or graphic of, just say what's in the image. And most importantly, if an image uses text to communicate, which we do in social media, make sure that the alternative text or the post contain the same text. Okay, so it's got to be either in the post or in the alternative text. So here are some great examples of alternative text. Now, I'm going to talk about X and Twitter, how they sort of keep changing how they deal with alternative text. One day the badge is there, the next day it's not. It's there for iPhone users, but not desktop users. So it sort of varies. But these are examples of brief, informative alternative text. President Kumar and Peter Dolan, chairman of the Board of Trustees, walked to the installation ceremony, and they've also used the photo credit there. Now, some people with disabilities, especially social media people, object to using alternative text to share photo credits. I'm of the opinion that as long as you've provided an adequate description of that graphic, I personally don't have a problem with using the alternative text to add a photo credit. What you don't want to do is put only a photo credit in the alternative text. That's not what it was designed for. And while I'm mentioning that, we also don't want to use alternative text to hide sort of Easter eggs or additional content. So we don't want to use it for any other purpose other than sharing a textual description of the graphic for people who are visually impaired or using screen reading software. Okay. Alternative text for other media. On most platforms, X is an exception. GIFs usually cannot be given alternative text in these platforms. So people have started including a brief description in the post if you want to show that you're being inclusive. And an example here is from Scope, where they're sharing their top tips to make posts more accessible. And they've just put in a bracket GIF, person flicking through social media on phone. So they've tried to make an attempt to describe the GIF. Now on Twitter or X, they do have alternative text on GIFs, which is great. But I think they're the only platform that does. You also want to caption your videos. If you're linking to a video, uploading a video, most platforms now will offer you a way to add captions to your video content. YouTube obviously does, Facebook does. If you're dealing with a platform that does not offer the ability to have the user turn captions on and off, there is an option for you to create open captions. There are several free apps on the web that will help you create what's called open captions. These are captions that are a permanent part of your video. In other words, you are doing the work of adding captions by making them a permanent part of your video. So that's also an option. Instagram does it through caption stickers, for example, so they may have different ways of allowing it, but if you're sharing video content on a social media platform, you're going to want to explore what options are available on that platform. Finally, something that you may not have heard of, but there is something called audio description. Now, audio description is not for the deaf and hard of hearing. Audio description is for people who are blind or have limited or low vision and can't see the video content. If you have a silent video or a music only video. This is narration that describes the imagery. And I'm not going to play these for you, but I have these links for you here that you can watch afterwards. If you have a non-narrated video montage, you can also upload a separate version of it that is described, where each image that is reflected in the video is also described. And UW here has done a really wonderful job. They've it's almost poetic the way that they have described their video. And I would share it with you now, but over Zoom, it's going to hesitate. And it just doesn't share well over Zoom. So I've provided these links for you if you want to learn more about audio description. That's a great example. And I'm always happy to talk more about it if you're interested. It's a great way to get creative and be more inclusive. Platform specific guidance. Now, I'm just going to run through these quickly. I am not the platform expert. You are all the platform experts. But as far as platform specific guidance, a few things I want to point out. Facebook. You can add alternative text to images on Facebook. They also will be generating automatic alternative text, but it's not great. It's things like man in suit, maybe grass. It's very vague, sort of identifying objects. It's getting better, but it's still not great. You're going to want to edit that automatically generated alternative text. You can add captions to your videos in Facebook, but you're going to have if it's on your own profile page, you're going to have to upload your own captions. They do not provide automatic captions. But if you're on a page, like with a capital P Facebook page, they are now offering AI generated captions, which you can edit, which is great. And then if you're doing a Facebook Live, they don't offer, as far as I know, someone can correct me if they've added this recently, but as far as I know, Facebook Live does not offer automatic captions, but you can invite a professional human captioner. And there is a way to have your Facebook Live events professionally captioned if you want to. There are some limitations. The biggest one being if you're using the Meta Business Suite, there is an alt text bug where if you're posting using the Meta Business Suite, even if you add alt text to your images, it may get lost when it gets posted. So you'll need to check that. There's no alternative text on stories. Suggested hashtags. This is one of those cases where when it prompts you to add hashtags, it will prompt you with all lowercase. You may need to edit those hashtags. And again, the automatic captions are available only on pages. I've provided links on the slide here to Facebook or Meta Accessibility Help and the Facebook Help Center for Accessibility. If you want to stay on top of it, you can follow them and get updated when accessibility features change, as they are wont to do. X, I guess I can get rid of Twitter in parentheses now because everybody's used to it. The visible alt badge, sometimes it depends on the device that you're using. It depends on the operating system that you're using. It depends on whether you are viewing it in your feed or on their timeline. I mean, it's just, there are so many variables, but Twitter X will also add that alt badge indicating the presence of alternative text. And the nice thing is you can have alternative text on your animated GIFs. Captions. So when they first launched X, I believe they had automatic captioning available, and it was so bad, they were getting so many complaints. Rather than try to fix it, they just took it away. So for now, if you want captions on your Twitter video content, you either need to make it as part of the video yourself, those open captions, or you can create the .srt caption file yourself if you know how to do that and upload it yourself. If you're in Spaces or using voice posts, they do have AI generated captions available. So hopefully they'll bring back automatic captions, bring that back to X at some point in the future. Known limitations. Number one, accessibility features for some reason on X They're unreliable and they break them all the time. They come and go. I don't know what it is, but they're just unreliable. Again, no AI generated captions on video content. And finally, they're not good about keeping their accessibility help up to date. So I've provided a link here to the accessibility help for X, but keep in mind that it may not always be accurate. Instagram, alt text for images, which is great. AI generated open captions, which is also great. For stories and reels, you have to use the caption stickers. And finally, AI generated closed captions if you're using Instagram TV or IGTV videos. There are also AI generated captions available for that. Known limitations, again, that Meta Business Suite alt text bug. Keep in mind that if you're adding alternative text through Meta Business Suite, it may get lost when it gets posted. Third-party tools, I think Hootsuite, somebody will have to update me on this, but I don't think this has been corrected yet, cannot post alt text either. No alt text on stories. So if you're posting images to stories, there's no alternative text. I don't know why. Maybe they consider them too brief. Who knows? But I've also provided a direct link to the Instagram Help Center for accessibility. LinkedIn, let's not forget about LinkedIn. They do allow you to add alternative text to images, but only on the desktop. If you're posting from a mobile device or from the app, they have not added the ability to edit alternative text yet for that. You can edit AI generated alternative text, which is nice. You can add closed captions. If you have a caption file that you want to upload, it will allow you to upload that .srt caption file. Some users can now take advantage of automatic captions. They are rolling this out in waves, I guess. I personally don't see it in mine yet, but you may in yours. They're one of the few sites that support that descriptive link text that I mentioned. The the ability to change your link to plain words rather than http://. So the ability to have descriptive links is a great feature for LinkedIn. And I've provided the LinkedIn help link here for you. YouTube, it's all about the captions. They have a great, well, first of all, automatic captions. It has a reputation for bad automatic captions, I do know, but it is getting better. But the nice thing is they have a wonderful caption editor. They have one of the most robust caption editors. You can create your own captions. You can upload text and it will sync the timings for you. You can edit the automatic captions. There are just so many wonderful things you can do with their caption editor. So you don't have to be stuck with their shall we say automatic captions, they call them. But I've got a link here to the Add Subtitles and Captions Google Help page if you want more information about using their caption editor. Couple resources here. I mean, if you just want to Google accessible social media, you'll find tons of blog posts and articles, but there are two sites that I recommend. Accessible Social is the one that I try to stay on top of. It's regularly updated with all of these interface changes and the accessibility features coming and going. So Accessible Social is a great site to follow. They have an X feed, but it's not updated. They do post regularly on Facebook though, and of course on their own blog. And then the US government of all places, the Federal Social Media Accessibility Toolkit. Social media is one of the primary ways we get the word out in case of emergencies. And, this is extremely important. There is a Federal Social Media Accessibility Toolkit, which is also a great resource that covers all of the things that I've just talked about, plus more. So now what I'm going to do is I'd like to open it up for questions. We've got a little over 10 minutes left, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording. So for those of you who are watching the recorded version, thanks for watching. And those of you who are here in person, let's